You have a miniature that you're about to paint. You found a sick color scheme that you want to copy. Maybe it's from another mini, maybe it's from a 2D piece of art. But unfortunately, somewhere in the translation, it got derailed, and now your mini looks like it got pollocked. So in this video, I'm gonna give you a big brain strategy so that this doesn't happen and reveal the step where your color scheme plans probably got derailed. All of the underlying ideas in this video are based off of 20 years working as a colorist in the entertainment industry. I spent a lot of time at work analyzing color in films, so the piece of art that I'm going to choose to lift a color scheme from for my miniature is actually a frame from a movie called The Fall, which you should definitely check out if you haven't seen it. I picked this frame specifically because it's going to be a good example of the most common pitfall when we get to that. If you aren't feeling super great about referencing a piece of 2D art, you could stay in a comfy, cozy kind of place just by sticking with a fantasy artist, like Frank Frazetta or Brahm. Or you could go totally crazy and pick something from an impressionist like Van Gogh, who in a lot of ways is kind of like an OG fantasy artist, or even graphic art like Frank Miller. Step 2, you've got your reference, and now we need to analyze it and figure out exactly what's going on. I like to use a free tool called Adobe Color for this. The way it default samples isn't perfect, so I need to point to the most prominent colors before I flip back to the color wheel. The way this color wheel works is that the angle radiating from the center of the circle is telling us the hue, and the distance from the center is telling us the saturation or vibrance of that hue. Looking at the red and green, I'm seeing based on the distance from the center that they are very saturated, and being across from each other on the color wheel means that they're complements. Wait, hold on. This is important. People can get really confused when it comes to naming color schemes. Complementary, split complementary, triadic, it's really just a bunch of confusing words. If you only know one thing about color schemes, one fundamental truth is that if you can create symmetric geometry with a relationship of the hues on the color wheel, then you have something that has the potential to work as a color scheme. But why is it fundamentally that geometric relationships work? And why is this wheel different from the artist's color wheel? And those are larger and more complicated questions for another video, and let me know if that's a video you want me to make. I can see the symmetry here really plainly. If I split the hues down the axis the yellow is on, there's symmetry on both sides. The two angles are equal. It's not 100% perfect to a degree, but that's typical for a real world example. So we figured out our colors, so let's slap them on this mini. Why am I doing this digitally and not on an actual mini with actual paint? The main reason is that translating the scheme to physical paint is a different skill, and I want to focus on the challenge of developing the scheme. If you want to see a video about paint selection and paint mixing, let me know, but I'm less interested in talking about how to do things and more interested in talking about how to think about them. I don't need to show you how to paint a mini to talk about the strategies for thinking about color. But hold on, this kind of looks like shit though, so what went wrong? This is really the most important critical point to make in this whole video. If you have a color scheme that you like, one that you're reacting to, it almost certainly has to do with the way the colors are used compositionally and proportionally. And this is where it's really easy to get off track. It's easy to just see a bunch of colors and not spend the time looking further to see how the colors are used. And we've got to figure out how to make this work though, so let's do a deeper analysis. What other information can we derive from this image? This book, Interaction of Color, is a total banger. My guy, Joseph Albers, and his Bauhaus bro Itten, in a different book, were the first to talk about something called contrast of proportion, which is also called contrast of extension. And this is about assigning field sizes according to the strength of the color. Okay, so basically, to balance a stronger, and a stronger in this case means higher saturated or higher value color, and a more desaturated or lower value color, the proportional size of the stronger color should be smaller. This is something you can see in our reference image. So here the saturated reds and greens take up a much smaller surface area of the image than the desaturated yellows. If we really want to get surgical with this analysis, we can bring it into my favorite free image editor, GIMP, and use it to separate the hue, saturation, and value. So this is something I've teased out of the image. This is basically a heat map telling us the saturation levels in the image. The most saturated red spots are where the color, regardless of the hue, is the most saturated. And it's really just in a few small spots, but that's not what I did on my mini. It has way too much surface area of the saturated colors and not enough of the desaturated ones. Here's our reference as value only. The areas of higher value contrast are in the foreground, paired with our more saturated characters, but the background is much lower contrast. It doesn't ever approach the brightness or darkness levels of the foreground. What this is telling us about the color scheme is that the more saturated colors go hand in hand with higher value contrast, and the desaturated colors are paired with lower value contrast. So to bring it all together, a big part of this color scheme is that it's a large field of desaturated low contrast yellows and reds that is a much smaller concentrated area of saturated color. And And if that doesn't make sense, here's an example of what the image would look like if the values and hues stayed the same, but the foreground was less saturated and the background was more saturated. Okay, final analysis, hue only. Here's the hues of the image, totally separated from saturation and value. What I'm immediately noticing here is what's symmetrical and what's not. There's some of the red in the very center of frame, but it's asymmetric to either side. The green is also asymmetric, weighted to the right, but the more saturated yellow is asymmetric to the left. It looks like what's happening here is that the asymmetries of the different hues are counterbalanced against each other to achieve a symmetrical balance, which is like a symmetry of asymmetries. It's pretty sick. Now that we actually have a valuable analysis, let's attempt again to deploy the scheme. This seems like a whole lot to try to slap on a Space Marine, but let's give it a shot. From the analysis, I know that the largest surface area of the Mini needs to be low contrast, desaturated yellows and reds, so I'm going to start with that. Then I'll add in some of the small areas of saturated color on the foreground equivalent of a Space Marine, which I'm going to say is the face, chest, and shoulders. Then I can kind of fiddle with everything to more faithfully match the distribution of the saturation and value from the reference. I think what's missing now is more of that symmetry in the desaturated areas, so I'll try building that into the knee pads and backpack. Is it perfect? Probably not, but this is a much better transposition of the color scheme by way of respecting the proportion and symmetry of color that we found in the reference. Okay, time to try for bonus round. Remember when we were looking at the symmetry of the scheme on the color wheel? We can keep investigating that symmetry to find another hue that wasn't in the reference frame, but could be included in the scheme if we wanted. So the hue that's on the other side of the wheel from the yellows is a blue cyan. And as far as the saturation goes, we kind of have to figure that out for ourselves. I'm thinking that since the saturated reds and greens are already doing a good job of directing the eye, we should keep our blue cyan color desaturated. I'm going to try dotting in here on some of the metallics, and that's basically it. Here's the final result. Would you actually want to paint a Space Marine like this? No, probably not. It's not an actual Space Marine chapter. It doesn't look very Space Marine-y, but the point is this is a much more accurate transposition of our original color scheme to this miniature. Rather than just sampling the colors and pasting them on, we're now thinking about things like symmetry and contrast of proportion, which gets to a bigger concept, which is what I've been trying to do with the videos that I've been making lately. A lot of videos just kind of tell you what to do, like take this Mephiston red and take this Goblin green and kind of layer it on like this, and maybe you'll get this kind of result. There's a lot about the literal steps of doing, but not a lot about how to use your brain to actually analyze why you're doing what you're doing. So if this kind of video, a video more about why we're doing what we're doing, and less about the literal steps of doing something, if this kind of video works for you, let me know what other kinds of topics you'd like to see broken down in an analytical way. It could be more topics on color schemes, on OSL, on non-metallic metal, about how to think about painting different materials. Just let me know what you guys think. Also, if you like this video, you should check out my most recent one about how to select a miniature for your Golden Demon project.